let's just jump into this officially here. Let me put on my glasses so I can actually see, and we take it from there. Latinx Talk Familia, it is my just immense pleasure to welcome Larry Lafontaine-Stokes to the program, to our book review series that we've got going on. It's so exciting. Let me do a quick introduction. Larry is a Puerto Rican writer, performer, and scholar. Born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Yes.
He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1991 and a doctorate in Spanish from Columbia University in 1999. He is currently a professor of Spanish American culture and women's and gender studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he specializes in Latina, Latino, Puerto Rican, and Hispanic Caribbean studies with additional interests in women's, gender, and sexuality studies, lesbian, gay, and queer studies, and theater and performance. And we are here to talk about his fabulous new book that I have a great copy of right here. I'm going to put it up right there like that. Great. Translocas, the Politics of Puerto Rican Drag and Trans Performance, published by the University of Michigan Press in 2021. It is an amazing book. And I'm so happy, Larry, to have you on our program and to talk about
thank you so much, Felipe. It's a real treat to be speaking to you and to be participating in this event for Latinx Talk, which is a site that we're so committed to. So I'm excited to talk to you about my new book.
Great. Well, I should say also that Larry is an editorial board member on Latinx Talk. And it's been great to get to know you the last few months, or the last year actually, that you've been on as editorial on the editorial board. And working with you has been a tremendous privilege. So thank you once again for making time to talk to us.
Thank you so much.
All right, let me just jump right in, okay? First of all, I want to start off biographically. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing. We know from your bio that you were born in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Did you grow up there? And how did you first get into the kind of academic work that you do?
So sure. So yes, I was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I grew up in a bilingual household because my father was from the United States and my mother, who is Puerto Rican, was raised in the United States. So we spoke English and Spanish at home, and I went to a bilingual or a dual language school. So I went to a school where I received 12 years of instruction in English and 12 years of instruction in Spanish. So I think from a very early age, I was aware of that complexity of biculturality, bilingualism, what it means to be an insider and an outsider at the same time. And while I was growing up, I think I had a suspicion or a sense that I was queer, but that certainly was not something that was tolerated or encouraged in the community where I grew up. So that's really something that I really was able to explore, acknowledge, or analyze, at least academically, much more when I went to college, when I left Puerto Rico. Although, truth be told, while I was in high school, I was already reading Truman Capote. I was reading Manuel Puig, The Kiss of the Spider Woman. So literature became like the space of opportunity for me to learn about gender and sexuality and to envision or acknowledge that there was a different world, that the very rigid heterosexual world that I lived in. I went to a Catholic school. We were members of a Catholic parish. That there were different worlds, and I think that's happened in college when I started to take classes. When I went to Brazil as part of study abroad and was really exposed to the vibrant queer world of Sao Paulo in the late 1980s. And in college, I really identified queer Latin American literature as something I wanted to explore, and that's what motivated me to want to go to graduate school. And I ended up writing a dissertation about Puerto Rican queer migration and culture, which was my first book, Queer Ricans, which came out in 2009 with the University of Minnesota Press. And kind of at the same time, I always loved drag. And in the early 2000s, I decided to write about drag. And actually, so this book started a really long time ago and took a really long time to come
Sure.
out, but I'm just really glad it's finally out.
Yeah. Well, you did a fantastic job. And one of the things that I really love, and I'm going to I'm going to ask you about this a little bit later in terms of your mastery of multiple disciplines and the way you engage different authors. But I want to start off. One of the things that I absolutely love and I often look for is the first sentence of a book and how an author draws you in to that. And I feel like when I read yours, I was hooked, and it was just the first one. And by the way, I'm a big fan of sentences, and so you have many good ones. You have many good ones throughout this book. But I'm going to start reading, and I want to read it so that everybody knows what
Sure.
exactly I'm talking about. But it's the first sentence of the introduction. It goes, this is what you wrote. You write, Translocas piss people off, but sometimes they also make us laugh and even cry. Um, why did you want to open the book like that? And how long did it take you to get that sentence right?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So I also love the craft of writing. I am a creative writer as much as a scholar who writes nonfiction or scholarship. And I knew that I wanted the writing to perform what I meant as much as to explain. Like there's something about letting words do their thing, and letting words lead you places, the same way that the cover of the book, like in
Yeah,
many ways I think that the cover of the book it is a summary of the book. I mean, I realize I actually have to explain what it is because it's not immediately self-evident, but there's like a way of seducing people,
yeah,
to interest them, to want them to read. There's also a sense of performing translocura, or performing that sense of what a the contradictions or the paradoxes
yeah,
of being a transloca or engaging transloca performance. Because in many ways I'm proposing that it has to do with madness. So it has to do with the meaning of loca in Spanish, the way that loca means a crazy woman, and that locura means madness in general. But it also refers to the way that loca is a term used to refer to effeminate homosexual men. So there's a play with the whole book is really structured around a play with language, and it's really structured around the contradiction of people's sense that drag queens are funny and entertaining, but also dangerous and undesirable.
yeah,
So it's a paradox, because like how can you be both? How can you be worthy of laughter, but at the same time be worthy of being murdered?
yeah,
Because you are such a transgression or a threat to normative society. And also it had to do a little bit with people's desire for me to position myself very explicitly, not simply as a scholar who was approaching this topic from an objective or uninterested position, but rather as a person who was fully committed, not only because I am a fan of drag and because I am a queer person, but also because as part of the process of writing the book, like some of the artists I write about invited me to perform in drag. So I think that first sentence, I don't really remember how it came to me, or where it came from, but
yeah,
I do know that, some people only read the introduction to a book.
yeah,
Some people might only read the first paragraph. So you have to make sure that it's really good, that
yeah,
it kind of like really conveys a lot of information. So that was, and also that it signals that this is it's not a typical academic book. It's a slightly different. It is an academic book. It has a bibliography. In fact, a really long bibliography. It
right,
has endnotes. It cites theory and criticism, but it's also about the pleasure of the word, the pleasure of performance, the pleasure of queer and transgression, and somehow how to do that with language. I think sometimes it works better, sometimes it doesn't. But that's like the hope
Yeah.
that people are going to enjoy that experience of reading.
I think you have another great sentence in there, and you mentioned it right now, where you talk about this is a book full of contradictions, full of paradoxes, and I did find myself trying to sort of keep up with the language and trying to keep up with the different words and different contexts. So you started talking about Translocas a little bit, and I'm going to ask you a question. I hope it makes sense, but I'm wondering if you can help us to better understand the term, its history and context, because you talk on one end about its sort of specificity, its cultural specificity. You have queer, C-U-I-R versus queer, Q-U-E-E-R, right? What does that mean? And then also, so that's one side of language. And then the other that you talk about that I thought was really fascinating was it was a brief conversation, but it was in there, and it really, as a historian that looks at activism, Silvia Rivera, right? And being able to see, being drawn in. And you say in your book, I'm not writing about activism, but I'm going to talk to you about her work and what she did, because she's so fundamentally important in this sort of narrative that you're highlighting. So who are these translocas? And you have different sort of cultural contexts that you situate them. Tell us about that. And I hope that made sense.
Oh, sure. No, yeah, it's a great question. So, but there's a couple of levels, or there's a
Yeah.
couple of things that are going on. So the first thing is that I am literally moving back and forth between English and Spanish, between Caribbean Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish, queer Spanish, and standard American academic English, queer English, American English. So there's like this back and forth. But there's also a back and forth. So it's kind of like trying to make sure that people are following me,
Yeah.
and that people who know Spanish are getting something out of it, and people who don't know Spanish are also getting something out of it. But it's also about making an argument for the specificity of queer language in English, in Spanish, in Spanglish, and its creativity, and its inventiveness. So the word transloca is technically a neologism. It's an invention. It really did not exist before like 20 years ago. And I thought I had made it up, and maybe I did, but it turns out that some other people had also made it up, like Lionel Cantu, a
Sure.
queer Chicano
Yeah.
sociologist, and who was working with a group of feminist women working in translation in Latin American and Latinx studies. So we all kind of came up with it at the same time. And I think so. Lionel Cantu, may he rest in peace, who died as an assistant professor. He wrote a book called The Sexuality of Migration. He had that camp queer sense to it. So he was really acknowledging that feminists, queer scholars, queer theorists, activists are often perceived as being crazy people because we challenge dominant social values.
Right.
But he was also recognizing the act of transnationalism, translocality, and translation. So what happens when you go back and forth, especially when in a context in which in US academia, some people feel that the American activism in the English language is just simply superior, more modern, and more advanced, and that the US has to save the rest of the world. Because gay activism or the women's liberation movement are somehow better in the US than they are elsewhere. People frequently don't know the history of queer activism in Latin America and the Caribbean. They don't know the history of the feminist movement in Latin America and the Caribbean. So there's lots of assumptions. So part of it is about language. What happens when we translate, we move back and forth? Why is translation so crucial? Why is it crucial for people in the US to read what is being published in Spanish, in Portuguese, in indigenous languages in Latin America? Why is it crucial to translate what is being written in English into Spanish? But not only the canonical works by white queer scholars, but also the works of queer of color and trans of color scholars. So it's a little bit, Translocas is a little bit about that play, that going back and forth. So I was interested in madness
Yeah.
and in women who are perceived as transgressors. So, for example, people like Erica Lopez, who is a
Mhm.
cisgender, bisexual, Afro-Puerto Rican writer and performer in San Francisco. But I was also interested in transgender activists like Silvia Rivera, who has really been a foundational figure in my life since I met her. Well, first I read about her in
Yeah.
Martin Duberman's book Stonewall, which came out in 1993. Then I met her in New York City. I invited her to a meeting of Latino gay men.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated by the complexity of her life as a homeless woman, as a sex worker, as an activist who established a group, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with the African American trans woman Marsha P. Johnson.
Mhm.
So how the gay and lesbian movement didn't know what to do with with trans women of color who lived on the street, who advocated for the rights of imprisoned people, who spoke openly about sexual violence and about sex work. So here I am writing a book. Well, I thought I was writing a book about drag queens. Like
Mhm.
that's what my book was first about. When I started this project in the early 2000s, it really literally was about gay men who dress in drag.
Mhm.
And at a certain moment, I realized, well, that's amazing, but it's just not enough. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense well, it's just impossible to talk about drag without acknowledging the centrality of transgender experience and how drag and trans are different, but they're also very related. So somehow, and as a Puerto Rican moving back and forth between Puerto Rico and the United States, I'm trying to think about what does Puerto Ricanness mean in English, in Spanish, in
Sure.
Spanglish,
Sure.
in the Caribbean, in the United States. Is transnationalism the most useful concept? And so, for example, people like Jorge Duani will
Sure.
argue that Puerto Rico is a trans nation. It is a nation without a state. It is a colony of the United States since 1898. But at the same time that people were using the concept of transnationality to see that phenomenon of circular migration, of diaspora, of bilingualism, of biculturalism, people were also looking at translocality as a term that can acknowledge somehow a more intimate form of the transnational,
Mhm.
something that has to do with travel, but also with technology, that maybe has to do with the moment we live in, the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st. So I was interested in playing with those words. I was interested in what happens if we try to think of locas in a translocal or transnational context, in a translational framework,
Right.
moving back and forth between English and Spanish, in a context in which white queer scholars in English think they know everything. And the queer of color and trans of color and queer diaspora critiques are trying to make an intervention and saying, actually, gay is not universal.
Mm.
Transgender is not universal. These words have a history and a specificity. And in Puerto Rico, it's really all about pato and maricón and loca and bucha and travesti and transformista. And in Mexico, it's really all about joto and jota and mushe. And in Argentina, it's about puto. And in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba, it's about pájaro. And language matters.
Yeah.
Language matters because
Yeah.
language is profoundly tied to identities, to social experiences, to realities, to violence, and to prejudice. When people wanted to insult me as a child growing up in Puerto Rico, it was not by saying Larry is gay, it was by saying Larry es pato. So,
Mm.
so for me, language is crucial. So as part of this broader exploration about effeminate homosexuality, about female madness, about drag performance, about trans activism and trans performance, like for me, language was very much part of that whole thing.
Yeah, language is a big part of it, and you're one of the things. The other thing that I appreciated, and this just sort of surfaced to my mind right now as you were talking about language in this way, is you in the book you don't run away from. I mean, you talk about kind of the beauty of it and the artistic form, and you don't run away from the violence and from you cite cases of murder, people that are actually murdered, and you bring this up, and then you have and I won't find the page, but I know there was a tweet that you put in here somewhere. Don Omar, is that
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah.
Here it is,
About Kevin Fred, yes.
about Kevin Fred. Tell us about that, and about why you felt it was so important to talk about violence in the way that you did.
So it's just inevitable, and I just thought that it would have been a disservice to write a book that was only about celebration and joy. It was just not true to the experience, because drag and trans performance are very much about joy and about entertainment and about creating community and about changing the way people think, but they are also about facing violence, facing aggression, negotiating poverty, negotiating exclusion and racism. So at some moment, it just, I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, that's really at the heart of the project.
Yeah.
It's at the heart of the project. Um, it was at the heart of project the moment people invited me to dress in drag, and all of a sudden I realized it's not just about the joy of performing in drag, but then what happens when you actually have to step outside, and all of a sudden you're like, am I going to get beat up?
Yeah.
Am I going to get gay bashed just because I'm stepping out, presenting in a feminine way, like whether it's taking a taxi, taking the subway, driving, walking on the street? Like how do you acknowledge like that violence that goes hand in hand with all the more positive, joyful, amazing elements of drag and trans performance, of queer experience, of trans experience? So that chapter on transloca epistemology was really trying to address that tension, that contradiction, that reality, which
Right.
is so that, for example, a drag performer like Jorge Flores, better known as Nina Flowers, burst onto the international stage in 2009 on the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race, and had to negotiate very complex issues regarding language because people made fun of Nina Flowers because she did not master standard American English and did not know all the references to gay American culture because she's from Puerto Rico and her first language is Spanish. But at the same time, she was extraordinary as androgynous drag figure who doesn't really who appears with like a bald head and tattoos and muscles. So people were nervous because she spoke Spanish and she used the word loca, but they were also nervous because she was not your typical female impersonator, which was who's typically all about emulating traditional beauty associated with women. So you have Nina Flowers on the one hand, but at the very same time that Nina Flowers was obtaining international recognition on RuPaul's Drag Race, you had a really horrendous murder in Puerto Rico of Jorge Steven Lopez Mercado, who was a young 19-year-old aspiring makeup artist, student, drag queen, who was not simply murdered, but their body was torn apart and burned. And so it was just like these things are happening literally at the same time in 2009. So how do you negotiate between that fear that being who you are is going to get you killed, and at the same time the recognition that being who you are is amazing and
Right.
might get you on television? And as I was wrapping up the book, there was another murder. There's always murders,
Yeah.
and in fact, so people like Francisco Galarte in his new book Brown Transfigurations really focus on that trans necropolitics, on that violence, which is really marks transgender and queer experience. So in 2019, as I was finishing my book, Kevin Fred, a young up and coming trap singer who was openly queer and very effeminate in Puerto Rico, also got murdered. For me, it was just a very strange experience to think that things are changing, but things remain the same, so that violence and that joy are both equally constitutive. So I wanted just to position that at the beginning of the book, as well as position the negotiation or the issue of poverty.
Right.
Because the violence of poverty, it's a different kind of violence. It's a different kind of exclusion that sometimes has to do with Blackness, sometimes has to do with running away as a young person who's been kicked out by your family. So in the case of Silvia Rivera, in the case of Holly Woodlawn, in the case of Monica Beverly Hills, like how do all these trans women like negotiate these exclusions, and in many cases remarkably overcome whether it is through comedy, and by taking advantage of the government, through welfare, which is sometimes work, but most of the time does not really work, or whether it is really by being an activist that envisions very different approaches to well-being, such as Silvia Rivera. And that's why, like, I did not think I was going to write about Silvia Rivera, but somehow it became impossible for me not to integrate her or to mention her. First of all, because probably she's the most famous trans person in the United States, certainly the most famous Latinx trans person. She's the first Latinx trans, well, she's the first trans person to be in the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. But also I knew her. She marked my life. She's a theorist. As a homeless transgender former sex worker, she was literally generating knowledge about the reality of people of color, of queer people, of homeless people, of people who suffer violence from the state. So I think that Silvia Rivera really gave me an optic, the same way that people see Gloria Anzaldúa or Shri Moraga or other queer thinkers as giving us the tools that we can use to analyze and understand our experience.
So when you talk about generating knowledge, I want to go there, and really try to highlight, for me, I was trained as a historian in Chicana and Chicano studies, and I feel like I've sort of, in the process of getting that training, have sort of grown up in an era where I had to, and was really sort of energized, as a lot of us were, to look more at sexuality and look at human sexuality and look at that part of the Chicano movement. And Maylee Blackwell's fantastic book, Chicana Power, really sort of talking about and getting us more sort of into these issues around gender, women's participation in the movement, and all of these things. And I wonder, and even now coming to this, I mean, being able to read your book, and first of all, folks, you should know this is highly readable. You do such a great job, I think, of navigating the difficulties of language, but then also presented it in a way that folks can pick it up. And I've also, you mentioned the Netflix series Pose. And those first 2 seasons, I'm waiting on season 3 now to start watching that. But that series has been such an eye-opening, experience for me to watch that and to see that on screen. I wonder what you think, or what you would say about Translocas, or about your own work, specifically helping us to better reimagine Latinx studies.
Yes.
Or how do you feel like what your work and that of your colleagues, right? You mentioned Francisco Galarte and others, to see kind of the reach and the possibilities of Latinx studies.
Yes. So I want to clarify. So my main commitment is to the artists I write about.
Yeah.
So for example, to Freddy Mercado, who's a Puerto Rican visual artist who appears on the cover. So my goal is to analyze and document the work of somebody like Freddy Mercado or Nina Flowers or Holly Woodlawn or Javier Cardona or Barbara Herr. But the way that I do it is through the lens of queer and Latinx studies. And the bibliography that I am interested in putting in conversation is precisely a Puerto Rican studies bibliography, a Latinx studies bibliography, and a queer of color and trans of color bibliography. So that to analyze a person like Freddy Mercado, who is on the cover of the book, I am interested in what Jose Esteban Munoz had to say in his early work, for example, in Disidentifications from 1999. I'm interested in what somebody like Ramon Rivera Cervera has to say in Performing Queer Latinidad. I'm interested in what Juana Maria Rodriguez had to say in her book, Queer Latinidad from 2003, if I'm remembering correctly. So how do I put these people in conversation? Some of them are Cuban American, some of them are Chicanx, some of them are Puerto Rican. So if you think of somebody like Frances Negron Montaner and her really landmark book, Boricua Pop, about Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American culture, somebody like David Roman, who is Colombian American, and his book, Performance in America. So like, how do I create like a network? It's almost like a rhizomatic map or bridges. Like, how do I bridge like what Cherie Moraga has to say about theory and the flesh, but also acknowledge the criticisms that Cherie Moraga has received for her trans exclusionary comments? Like, how do I acknowledge that Gloria Anzaldúa was writing about the US Southwest, but that her concepts of borderlands and autohistoria teoria can be useful to think about how a person like Barbara Herr, who is a transgender Puerto Rican performer in New York City, thinks about her life in her one-woman show, Transmission. So I think it really is about pushing Latinx studies, encouraging people in Latinx studies to acknowledge that queer and trans are central categories of analysis, and that there is a crucial bibliography that you can trace it to 1981 with this bridge called My Back, edited by Anzaldúa and Moraga. You can trace it to Jose Esteban Munoz in 1999. You can trace it to Juana Maria Rodriguez and Ramon Rivera Cervera. But how has it changed? Like, how has it evolved? So that's on the one hand, like making an intervention in Puerto Rican, Caribbean, Latin American, and Latinx studies. The other simultaneous intervention is in queer and trans studies, because queer studies in the United States at a certain moment, certainly the way that people perceived queer theory, it was as an almost exclusively white project that had come out of nothing, had been invented by Judith Butler and like by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, that included people like Jack Halberstam, but that somehow magically had no Black scholars, no Latinx scholars, no Native American or Asian American, Pacific Islander American scholars. So the queer of color critique, the trans of color critique also challenge the exclusions that also were very central in mainstream feminism and in mainstream women's studies, so that women of color feminism, Chicana feminism make that intervention. So that's the kind of work that I see my scholarship doing. So on the one hand is to tell Puerto Ricans, you really have to talk about queer and trans issues if you really want to understand what it means to be Puerto Rican.
Right.
But I'm also telling queer and trans people, you really have to talk about race and ethnicity as critical categories of analysis, like to not pay attention to race, ethnicity, diaspora, language, translation, translocality, transnationalism, and diaspora is a disservice. It's a disservice to understand what really happens, what's really going on. So that's the kind of bridging work that I see myself doing.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. I appreciated it. And I know that our listeners did as well. I have one more question for you, Larry. On a more personal note, in the book, you write about becoming a transloca a Midwestern transloca. Tell us about that process and what it has meant to your professional and to your personal life.
So that's a funny and complex question.
Sure.
I think it responds to an interest since the at least the 1990s, but maybe even before, for scholars, intellectuals to really position themselves, ground themselves, like acknowledge where they speak from, acknowledge how their identity informs what they say or what they don't say. And in my case, well, I am a queer Puerto Rican who was invited by artists to perform in drag. So this project had really two distinct moments. There was an early moment in which I really saw myself as a gay Puerto Rican writer and scholar, and in New York City. So New York City for me was a very formative period, because New York City is practically part of Puerto Rico. I think there's like 1 million Puerto Ricans in
Sure.
New York
Yeah.
City. There's cultural institutions. So hanging out with people like the writer Angel Lozada and with other people. So New York was much queerer for me in a Puerto Rican sense than Puerto Rico was, because Puerto Rico was much more about family and neighborhood and like the world I grew up in, as opposed to the world I became exposed to as a diasporic queer Puerto Rican. So when I started this book, of course I was a loca because, well, don't go around saying loca. The loca is a very complex, a very
Yeah.
fascinating term. It's an in-community term. It
Yeah.
is a term that can be a horrible insult or an epithet, but it can also be a term that creates ties of affinity and of community when people use it among themselves.
Yeah.
So it is a dangerous word. It is a complicated word. I remember Angel Lozada calling me loca, and at first I was very disoriented. I was like, why is he using the feminine? Why is he calling me a loca? What is loca all about? So that's one stage. And clearly, for me, being gay was all about going to drag shows. It was
Mhm.
about going to queer venues, queer nightclubs like La Escuelita on 39th Street and 8th Avenue in New York City, and seeing extraordinary drag and trans performers like Lady Kateria, who took my breath away. So at first I was thinking, I love drag. I want to write about drag and trans performers because they are amazing. What they do is incredible, whether they do it in a nightclub or in a museum or in a theater or on television or in the movies. And then at a certain moment, people were like, it's nice that you're writing about us, drag and trans performers, but why don't you want to be a drag queen? I'm thinking, not really, but I have nothing against it. So Fausto Fernos invited me to appear in the premiere episode of Cooking with Drag Queens. So Fausto Fernos and his partner, now husband Mark Felian, have a podcast in Chicago called Feast of Fun. And in 2010, they decided they wanted to do a drag queen cooking show. And they decided that it would be hilarious to have Larry dress up in drag. So I had never done drag. Well, maybe I had, but not really. Like I hadn't really done drag, like in terms of like doing it, documenting it, talking about it, having photos and videos circulating online. So in 2010, we did a video, Cooking with Drag Queens, how to make tostones, which is fried green Puerto Rican plantains. Um, and people got so excited because that's a really funny thing about drag. People get really excited. Like somehow drag queens tap into this unconscious happiness that people
Uh,
have. Not everybody. Some people
right.
get really angry and
Right.
very, very like, mean and violent. But many nice people get very excited when they see you in drag. And all of a sudden I had done this video and people like want to see me performing in person. And I'm thinking, I don't know how to do drag makeup. It's a theatrical skill. I I'm not a trained performer. I didn't go to school to learn how to do theatrical makeup. So people are like, well, just learn, watch YouTube tutorials. So so all of this is happening, and then all my friends, Ramon Rivera Cervera and others, are like, oh, okay, so now you're going to reflect and theorize about the meaning of all of this. And I am like, I am. And they're like, you have to. And I'm like, I do. And the truth is that it was like a really fascinating exercise. People really forced me. There was an expectation that it would really not just be like a fun activity, but that I could really use it as a lens. I
Mm,
could really use it as a way to try to understand what I was writing about in a different way. It's not that you have to do drag in order to write about drag. Well, the same way that you don't have to do something to understand it fully, but the truth is that it does allow you to approach it and understand it differently. It allowed me to understand how difficult and complex drag makeup is. It allowed me to understand how complex it is to wear a girdle and padding and to go shopping for women's clothes and to put on a wig and to make sure that the wig is not falling in front of your face and to realize how complex it is to step out of the house dressed in drag and to be afraid that somebody's going to beat you up.
mm.
So I think that there was a real value to the experience. So I'm thankful. I am thankful that Fausto Fernos invited me to partake of drag as much as to move me from simply being a fan of drag. And I think being a fan of drag is already a lot, because being a fan of anything is a very complex identity. You adore things. You love things. You appreciate them from the perspective of a person who's really committed, whether it's to baseball, or to the Catholic Church, or to whatever it is.
Sure.
So I really value, and I think that being a fan of drag and trans was already really important for me as a gay, queer, loca Puerto Rican. But becoming a drag performer, I think, added and expanded. And so the question is, I try to address it. I try to incorporate it, integrate it, discuss it. I didn't want the book, and people did not want the book to be about me. So it's
Sure.
not about having the book be about Larry Lafontaine. The book is really about Barbara Herr and about Lady Kateria and Javier Cardona and Jorge Merced and Freddy Mercado and Silvia Rivera. It's really about them, but it's about what it means for me being who I am to be writing about them, and to be thinking about drag and trans in a hemispheric context, thinking through the vocabulary of Mexico and Argentina and Chile, thinking through the bibliography of people like Reinaldo Arenas and Pedro Lemebel and Nestor Perlonger, trying to push American academia to acknowledge that thought theory is created in Latin America and the Caribbean as much as in the United States, that theory is created in Spanish and Portuguese as much as it is in English, and to use that framework to analyze, to analyze, discuss, and document like these amazing performers and artists and thinkers that I write about. So that's my hope, that people who engage this book, like you want to read this book, it's because it's about queerness and Latinidad and Latinoamericanismo and Puerto Ricanness in the Caribbean. But it's also because Freddy Mercado is amazing and Barbara Herr is amazing and Silvia Rivera is amazing. And everybody should know who Silvia Rivera is. And
Yeah.
if you don't, well, my book is one way, one window into Silvia Rivera and into a lot of additional really amazing, really fascinating performers, writers, and activists.
Larry Lafontaine Stokes has written the book, folks, Translocas, The Politics of Puerto Rican Drag and Trans Performance, University of Michigan Press, published just this year, 2021. Larry, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. This was so much fun. I learned a tremendous amount. And thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And if people are interested in buying it direct from the University of Michigan Press, you can get a 30% discount by using the code UMS 21, I think. But there's a flyer. There's a flyer that we can include as part of this. So I believe it's UMS 21 will get you 30% off if you want to buy it directly from the University of Michigan Press. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Felipe.
Great. Thank you, Larry.